Welcome to this deeply emotional and thought-provoking story. This is not just a tale of transformation, but also a testament to the fact that it's never too late to correct the mistakes of the past. With its intertwining themes of regret, love, and the effort to create a better future, this story will make you reflect on what you can do to change your own life and the lives of those around you. Stay tuned, and who knows, you might find something you've been searching for in your own life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new updates. Sit back, relax, and let the story take you through its emotional journey. You won't want to miss a single moment. Charles Bennett had everything, or at least that's what people thought when they saw him. His tailored suits, his sleek, high-end cars, his impeccable mansion perched like a fortress on a hill overlooking the city. To outsiders, Charles was the picture of success, a billionaire who had mastered the world of finance and lived a life others only dreamed of. But behind the golden gates and polished marble floors, Charles was a prisoner of his own making. The sprawling mansion that stood as a symbol of his achievements was, for all intents and purposes, a prison now. He had built it for her, his wife, Sylvia. It was her dream, the one she had talked about when they first met, her vision of a grand home filled with laughter, love, and life. Sylvia had been the light of Charles's world, the fire that had kept him warm during the coldest of nights. But that warmth was gone now, snuffed out the day she passed away. It had been sudden, unexpected, a sharp jolt that tore through the fabric of Charles's life, a heart attack. Just like that, everything he had worked for, everything he had thought mattered, evaporated. All he was left with was an empty house, a vast cold space that echoed with memories. The mansion was now just a shell, a reminder of what could have been. Every room he entered felt like it had been abandoned long before Sylvia's passing, each corner shadowed with an oppressive silence that made him feel more alone than ever. The grand living room, with its towering windows that once allowed the sun to stream in, was now a cavern of emptiness. The grand piano in the corner, once played by Sylvia in the evenings, was gathering dust, its keys untouched for years. Even the garden, which Sylvia had lovingly tended to, had fallen into neglect. The once vibrant flowers were now withered and overgrown, the lush green lawn now an untamed wilderness. Charles had stopped caring for it, just as he had stopped caring for himself. He had everything a man could want: money, power, respect, but none of it meant anything when he returned home to the hollow emptiness of his mansion. His success in the finance world had earned him everything he thought he ever wanted, but it had also isolated him. Charles no longer had the heart for the world he had once dominated. He hadn't the patience for his colleagues, and the socialite parties had grown too noisy, too empty. The dinners, the speeches, the meetings, all of it felt like a mask, a performance he no longer had the will to put on. Charles sought solace in his own company, but no amount of luxury or wealth could fill the void left by Sylvia. There was no joy in his fortune anymore, no thrill in his business dealings. He had everything, but nothing at all. So he did what he had done countless times before. He left. He left the mansion, escaping the suffocating silence that waited for him behind the walls. He had stopped going to his office. He had stopped making grand appearances. Instead, he found peace in the simple, unremarkable things. The anonymity of the world outside his bubble became a refuge, a place where no one expected anything from him. A place where he could simply be. And that's how Charles Bennett found himself sitting in a small, modest coffee shop on the edge of town one rainy afternoon. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of pastries and the warmth of the space. The shop wasn't anything like the high-end cafes he was used to. No polished glass tables, no sleek minimalist design. It was old-fashioned, with wooden floors and mismatched chairs, the kind of place you'd expect to find in a cozy corner of a small town. There was something reassuringly ordinary about it. Charles took a seat by the window, watching as the rain pattered against the glass. He wasn't there for the coffee, though it was good, rich, and full of flavor. No, he came here for the silence, the anonymity. He could be anyone in a place like this. No one knew his name. No one cared that he was Charles Bennett, the billionaire financier. As he sipped his coffee, he allowed himself to sink into the moment, letting the noise of the outside world fade away. The shop was small, but it had its charm. The hum of quiet conversation filled the space, punctuated by the occasional clink of cups or the hiss of the espresso machine. There was a comfort in the simplicity, in the way everything felt so unaffected by the weight of wealth or status. It was then that he noticed them. Margaret and Elijah. They had walked in from the rain, their clothes damp from the downpour. Margaret, an older woman with soft gray hair pulled back in a loose bun, had an air of quiet grace about her. She carried herself with a kind of dignity that was rare, and Charles noticed how she moved through the world with a calm, unhurried confidence. Her eyes, though. Something in those eyes. They held a depth, a wisdom that immediately drew him in. Elijah, her companion, was a younger man, maybe in his 30s, dressed in a simple suit that looked a little out of place in the humble surroundings. He had the kind of face that suggested he had seen hardship, a hard life that had left its mark on him. His eyes were weary, but there was a quiet strength about him, something that made Charles pause. They didn't notice him, or if they did, they didn't care. The two of them moved to a small table near the back, their conversation soft, but not in any way that would make Charles feel uncomfortable. They spoke as if they had all the time in the world, as if they had no need to impress anyone. As the rain continued to pour outside, Charles found himself drawn to them. It wasn't the way they looked or the way they dressed, but something about the way they carried themselves. They were real, genuine, unpretentious. Unlike the world Charles had come from, where every interaction felt like a transaction, where everyone had an agenda and a mask they wore for survival, here, in this little coffee shop, there was something that made him want to stay longer. The barista, a young woman with a bright smile, came over to take their order. Charles watched as Margaret leaned forward, speaking to her kindly, while Elijah pulled out a crumpled note from his pocket to pay. There was no rush, no urgency in their movements. The moment felt suspended, a brief slice of calm in a world that had long since abandoned it. Charles sat there, still as a statue, wondering why he had come here. What was it about this small coffee shop, this odd little pair, that had captivated his attention so completely? Was it their simplicity, their groundedness in a world that seemed so far removed from his own? Or was it something more? For the first time in a long time, Charles didn't feel quite so alone. As the minutes ticked by, he found himself unwilling to leave. He couldn't explain why. He had no desire to speak to them, no reason to intrude on their quiet conversation. But he couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in years, he had found something worth holding on to. Elijah had always felt like he was walking a tightrope, balancing between two worlds that never seemed to understand him. At just 12 years old, he already carried the weight of a lifetime on his small shoulders. His hands were rough from the hours spent working part-time at the coffee shop, and his clothes, always a little too big, hung loosely on his frail frame. It was a far cry from the world of luxury that Charles Bennett knew, yet in a strange way, Elijah felt a connection to him. Both were outsiders, isolated in their own right, though the reasons for their solitude couldn't have been more different. Elijah's life had never been easy. He had never known the comfort of a full family, or the security of a stable home. His father had disappeared before he was born, leaving behind nothing but a memory that his mother, Sophia, had tried her best to erase, Sophia had been a fighter, a woman who loved deeply and fought fiercely to make sure her son had everything he needed, even when life had given them so little. She worked long hours as a nurse, earning just enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. But no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. When Elijah was still a toddler, they had moved from one apartment to another, always chasing after something better, something more stable. But stability was a fleeting dream, one that always seemed just out of reach. Every move brought new challenges, new schools, new neighbors who never bothered to learn their names. Elijah had learned early on that he had to be tough, that life wasn't going to hand him anything, that if he wanted something, he would have to fight for it. Despite the struggles, Sophia had been his rock, her love for him unwavering. She had always told him that he was special, that he was destined for greatness, even when the world around them seemed to say otherwise. "You have the heart, Elijah," she would say, brushing his hair back from his forehead as she tucked him into bed. "That's what matters most. You've got a heart that could change the world." But those words, those comforting words from his mother, became the anchor that kept Elijah grounded after she passed away. It happened suddenly, so suddenly that it felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. One moment he had kissed her goodbye as she left for work, and the next, she was gone. A heart attack, the doctor said. The woman who had been his world, the one who had fought so hard to give him a better life, was taken from him without warning, leaving him adrift in a world that suddenly felt too big and too cold. Her death left an ache in his chest that never truly went away. Elijah was left to navigate the world without her, a boy on his own in a place that never seemed to care. The world wasn't kind to him, and in many ways, he had learned to fend for himself. Sophia had done her best to shelter him, to provide him with a sense of security. But when she was gone, there was nothing left but a deep, hollow emptiness. In the wake of her death, Elijah was taken in by his grandmother, Ruby, a woman whose tough exterior often made people think she was too harsh, too unyielding. But beneath her gruffness, Ruby was a woman of deep love and devotion. She did what she could to raise Elijah, even though she struggled with her own health and her meager pension. The two of them had learned to make do, scraping by on the bare minimum, but there was a bond between them that kept Elijah from feeling completely alone. Ruby's small apartment was a far cry from the grandeur of Charles Bennett's mansion. It was cramped, with peeling paint on the walls and mismatched furniture that was always slightly off-kilter. The smell of old wood and incense lingered in the air, a mix of memories and the passing of time. There was never enough money for anything extra, but there was always love. Ruby loved Elijah in her own way, tough love that came with lessons on resilience, self-reliance, and the harsh realities of life. She taught him how to survive, how to take care of himself, even when the world seemed against him. But Ruby wasn't perfect, and neither was the life they lived. She had her own battles with her health, and as she got older, it became harder for her to keep up with the demands of raising Elijah. There were days when Elijah had to help her with basic tasks, when he had to step into the role of caregiver instead of the other way around. But through it all, there was one thing that kept him going: the memory of his mother. Sophia had left behind a small, worn diary, its pages yellowed and fragile from years of being tucked away. Elijah found it shortly after her death, hidden under the floorboard in her old room. It was a treasure trove of memories, a glimpse into the life of the woman who had given him everything. In the diary, Sophia wrote about her hopes, her dreams, her struggles, and her love for him. It wasn't just a collection of thoughts. It was a bridge to the past, a way for Elijah to feel connected to the woman who had raised him. As Elijah read through the pages, he could hear her voice in his mind, her words echoing in the silence of his room. "You are my greatest gift, Elijah," one entry read. "No matter what life throws at us, remember that you have a heart full of love and the strength to face anything." The diary became his lifeline, his connection to the mother who was no longer there to guide him. It was the one thing he had that nobody could take away, the one thing that reminded him he wasn't alone in the world. Every day, he would read a new passage, finding comfort in the words that spoke to him from the pages. The diary became his anchor, the only piece of his old life that still held meaning. Even at the coffee shop, as he wiped down the tables and took orders, Elijah's mind often wandered back to those pages. He would pull the diary out from under his pillow late at night, his fingers tracing the words as if they held the key to understanding everything. He wasn't sure what the future held or how he was going to make it, but he knew one thing for sure. His mother's love, the heart she had passed down to him, would be the thing that carried him through. But life wasn't kind to Elijah. He knew that. He had seen enough of the world to understand that nothing was guaranteed. But still, he held on to that heart, even as he worked long hours at the coffee shop, even as he saw the cold stares from the people who came in and out, treating him like nothing more than a server. He held on to the one thing his mother had always told him. You have the heart, Elijah. That heart, full of hope, love, and unyielding strength, was his greatest asset, and it was something that no one could ever take away. The days seemed to bleed into one another for Charles Bennett. He continued to visit the coffee shop regularly, drawn by something he couldn't quite explain. The space was calming, an escape from his grand, empty mansion. The silence there didn't press on him like the silence at home. And then there was Elijah. Charles couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something about the boy that kept him coming back. Maybe it was the way Elijah worked tirelessly at the coffee shop, his small hands moving deftly over the counter, always with a slight frown of concentration. Or perhaps it was the way Elijah's eyes seemed to hide a world of sorrow, one that seemed far beyond his years. Charles couldn't ignore it. There was a story there, one that Elijah wasn't ready to share, but it called to him. At first, their conversations were casual. Charles would sit at his usual spot, sipping his coffee while Elijah worked. Their exchanges were small, often nothing more than a polite nod, or the occasional, "How's your day going?" from Charles. Elijah would smile, but there was always a distance in his eyes, as though he were somewhere far off in his mind, thinking about something else entirely. But as the weeks passed, their brief interactions began to deepen. One rainy afternoon, after the coffee shop had quieted down, Charles found himself sitting there, his mind wandering. The barista was absent, and Elijah had taken a rare break, sitting at a table with a cup of coffee in his hands. Charles, unsure why, walked over and sat down across from him. "Mind if I join you?" Charles asked, breaking the silence. Elijah looked up, startled for a moment before nodding. "Sure," he said softly, his voice quiet, as though unsure whether he should invite the company. He didn't meet Charles's eyes right away, instead staring down at the steam rising from his cup. Charles watched him for a moment, his gaze sharp but unassuming. "You know," Charles said, breaking the silence, "I've been coming here for a while now, and you always seem to be the hardest worker. I'm curious, how do you manage it, all that work, and you're still here day after day?" Elijah shifted in his seat, glancing up at Charles for the briefest of moments before looking away again. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice almost inaudible. "I just have to." There was something in the way he said it, something heavy. Charles felt the weight of it, an unspoken truth hiding behind those words. It wasn't just the work Elijah did at the coffee shop. It was everything that lay beneath the surface. Charles wasn't used to feeling like this, compelled to dig, to pry into someone else's life. But with Elijah, there was something pulling him in. He could feel it, like a quiet tug at his very core. After a few moments of silence, Charles leaned forward slightly. "What about your family?" he asked, his voice gentle, as though he were treading carefully around a fragile subject. "Are you close with anyone outside of work?" Elijah's hands gripped the sides of his cup a little too tightly, and his eyes flickered with something Charles couldn't quite place. I live with my grandmother," Elijah said quietly. "She takes care of me." Charles paused, studying the boy's face. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something almost like sadness mixed with a quiet determination. He didn't press further. He could tell this wasn't the topic Elijah was willing to delve into. "How's she doing?" Charles asked instead, deciding to change the subject slightly. "She's okay," Elijah replied, his voice more stable now, though still carrying a faint sadness. "She's getting older, though. It's harder for her to keep up. I help her out when I can." Charles nodded, sensing that there was more, but he also understood when to leave well enough alone. He could see the boy's reluctance to share, and he respected it. But even then, there was something about the way Elijah spoke, the little details he let slip, that made Charles more certain than ever that the boy had a story to tell, a story that Charles felt somehow connected to. It wasn't just the grief in Elijah's eyes, it was the way he carried himself, the quiet strength he had despite the weight of his circumstances. There was something familiar about it. The next few days passed, and Charles continued to visit the coffee shop. Each time, he saw Elijah a little more, noticed how he interacted with the customers, how he worked so diligently without a single complaint. There was something almost otherworldly in the way he seemed to hold his pain behind his eyes, his resilience shining through despite everything. It wasn't until one afternoon, when Margaret joined them at the table, that Charles began to piece together more of Elijah's story. Margaret had always been kind to Charles. She was older, with graying hair and a warm smile that seemed to light up the room whenever she entered. She had a way about her, a quiet grace that made her stand out in any room. That afternoon, she took the seat next to Charles, her eyes immediately landing on Elijah as he worked behind the counter. "You know Elijah's a good kid," Margaret said, her voice carrying a hint of pride. "He's been through a lot, but he never complains. It's rare to find someone like him." Charles, curious as always, raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his tone neutral, though his interest was piqued. "What's his story?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, her eyes drifting toward Elijah. The boy had been looking out the window, his focus lost in thought. She lowered her voice, ensuring that only Childs could hear her words. "Elijah's mother, Sophia, was a single mother," Margaret began, her voice soft, as though speaking of a memory she held dear. "She worked hard, worked more than anyone should ever have to, just to keep things together. She loved Elijah with everything she had, but life was never kind to them." Charles leaned forward, his interest growing. "What happened to her?" Margaret sighed, a shadow passing over her face. "She passed away a few years ago," she said quietly. "A heart attack, just like that. Elijah was still so young, only 8 or 9, and after that, he came to live with his grandmother. But it's never been easy for him." Charles watched Elijah out of the corner of his eye. The boy didn't seem to notice the conversation happening behind him, but Charles couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. "That's a hard thing for a child," Charles said, his voice filled with quiet empathy. "To lose a parent so young." Margaret nodded. "It's changed him," she said, her eyes softening. "But, you know, despite everything, he never lets it define him. He works hard every day, helps his grandmother. He's strong, that boy, stronger than anyone I know." Charles couldn't help but wonder about the bond Elijah had with his mother. He knew from his own experiences how the loss of a loved one could haunt a person, could shape their entire existence in ways that weren't always visible to the outside world. But Elijah was different. He wasn't hiding behind walls of bitterness or anger. He wasn't letting the grief consume him. Instead, Elijah was finding a way to survive, to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders with quiet dignity. Charles's mind was racing now, his curiosity about Elijah growing deeper. There was something about the boy, something he couldn't quite grasp, that made him feel a pull, like a magnetic force drawing him in. It wasn't just the boy's difficult circumstances, it was the mystery that surrounded him. The way he seemed so much older than his years, so wise despite everything he had endured. And then there was the diary. Charles didn't know why, but he felt a strange connection to it. The idea that a small, worn diary, filled with the words of a mother who had passed away, could hold so much meaning for Elijah. There was something about that connection, the way a mother's love could transcend even death, that seemed to mirror his own pain, his own unresolved grief for Sylvia. For the first time in a long while, Charles felt a stirring of something in his heart, something he couldn't name, something deep and raw, something that made him want to understand the boy, to know his story. And so, as the rain began to fall outside, the warmth of the coffee shop wrapping around him like a blanket, Charles Bennett made a decision. He would get to know Elijah, not as the wealthy businessman who sat at the corner of the shop with nothing to do, but as someone who had a chance, just maybe, to understand what it meant to carry pain, to survive, to rebuild from the ashes of loss. The mystery of Elijah's life wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a call to something deeper, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But one thing was certain, he couldn't look away now. Charles Bennett had always prided himself on being a man who understood how the world worked. He had built his empire from the ground up, navigating through the most treacherous corners of the finance world with an instinct for survival. But in all his years, nothing had prepared him for what he was about to uncover about Elijah and the tragic secrets that bound their lives together. The realization didn't come all at once. It started with small, unsettling clues, bits of information that didn't seem to add up, no matter how much Charles tried to dismiss them. There was something about Elijah's quiet strength, the way he carried the weight of his grief that didn't sit right. And then there was the diary, the old, tattered journal that Sophia had left behind, which Elijah held so dear. The more Charles learned about Elijah, the more he felt like there was a deeper connection to his past, one he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The pieces began to fall into place during one of his visits to the coffee shop. Charles had grown accustomed to sitting in the same corner, watching Elijah as he worked, trying to piece together the boy's story in his mind. But this time there was something different. There was a tension in the air, an undercurrent that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface. Elijah was sitting at a table, staring down at the diary that Charles had seen him read so many times before. The boy's fingers traced the worn pages gently, as if seeking comfort from the words that seemed to hold more than just memories. Charles hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach, but something within him, a gnawing feeling deep in his chest, pushed him forward. He walked over slowly, taking a seat across from Elijah. The boy didn't look up, but Charles could see the way his lips tightened, the way he gripped the edges of the diary, as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "Mind if I join you?" Charles asked softly, his voice gentle. Elijah didn't respond right away, but after a moment, he nodded, still not meeting Charles's eyes. "Something on your mind?" Charles asked, trying to sound casual, though he knew this wasn't just a simple conversation. Elijah exhaled sharply. a breath full of something that wasn't anger, but something darker. "It's nothing," Elijah muttered, but Charles could hear the weight in his voice. He knew the boy wasn't being honest. Charles leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "You don't have to talk about it, Elijah," he said, his tone softening. "But if you ever want to share, I'm here to listen. Do you have any questions? Leave a comment. I will try to answer all." Elijah shifted in his seat, his eyes finally meeting Charles's for the first time. There was something raw in his gaze, something haunted. "You wouldn't believe it if I told you," Elijah said, his voice barely a whisper. Charles's heart tightened, a sense of foreboding creeping in. "Try me," he said, his words calm, but the weight of them hung in the air between them. Elijah stared at the diary for a long time before slowly pushing it across the table toward Charles. Charles hesitated before reaching for it, his fingers brushing the edges of the worn cover. The moment he touched it, something inside him jolted, a deep sense of recognition. As he opened the pages, the familiar handwriting of Sophia filled the space before him. But it wasn't just the words that caught his attention. It was the photograph tucked between the pages, a photograph that made his blood run cold. It was a picture of a house, a mansion, one that Charles knew all too well. The luxurious estate had once belonged to a man named Richard Bennett, Charles's older brother, a man whose shadow had hung over Charles's life since childhood. Richard had been a cruel, domineering figure in the Bennett family, a man with a thirst for power that had only grown as the years passed. Charles had always despised him, but the connection between Richard and Elijah's mother, Sophia, was something he had never suspected. "I found that picture in my mom's things," Elijah said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's from before she met my dad, before everything fell apart." Charles felt a sickening wave wash over him. The pieces were falling into place now, and the truth, horrifying as it was starting to take shape in his mind. "You know him, don't you?" Elijah continued, his voice trembling slightly. "You know my mom's past? You know what happened before everything changed?" Charles's mind was racing now, his thoughts spinning in a blur. Richard had always been ruthless, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And now it seemed his twisted influence had seeped into Sophia's life as well. Charles looked down at the photograph again, his hands trembling. There, in the opulent living room of Richard's mansion, stood Sophia, looking young, vibrant, and full of hope. But standing beside her was a man Charles didn't recognize, his face clouded with anger and contempt. The man was pointing a finger at Sophia, and the look in his eyes, vengeful, accusing, spoke volumes. Charles's heart sank as he read the hastily scrawled note on the back of the photo. "You think you can escape me? You're wrong, Sophia. This will be the end of you." The words echoed in Charles's mind, each one a sharp stab to his chest. Richard had been involved with Sophia, had likely been the man responsible for the destruction of her life, and perhaps her eventual death. And now, the connection between him and Elijah, his own flesh and blood, was undeniable. Charles's mind flashed back to the years he had spent trying to escape Richard's shadow. The two brothers had never been close. Richard had always been the favored son, the one who inherited their father's estate and the family name. Charles, on the other hand, had always been the black sheep, the one who had to fight for everything he had. The resentment between them had only deepened after their father's death, when Richard had made it clear that he intended to control everything, including Charles's life. But Richard's obsession with power had never once extended to his family, until now. Charles looked up at Elijah, his heart heavy with guilt. The boy's mother, Sophia, had suffered under Richard's tyranny, just as Charles had. She had been trapped in his web of manipulation and control, and now her son was the one left to bear the scars. The realization hit Charles with the force of a wrecking ball. Elijah's mother had died because of Richard, and Elijah was left with nothing but the aftermath. For a long moment there was only silence between them. Elijah sat motionless, watching Charles, as if waiting for him to speak. But what could Charles say? How could he explain to this boy, this child who had already lost so much, that his life, his suffering, had been caused by the very man who had shaped Charles's own painful existence? Finally, Charles spoke, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know any of this." Elijah nodded, his eyes filled with something close to understanding. "I didn't know either, not until I found that picture." His voice faltered. "But it doesn't matter now, does it? My mom's gone, and I'm stuck with the consequences." Charles felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't undo the pain that had been caused, but he could make things right for Elijah. He could help him, protect him from the things that had destroyed his mother's life. "What happened to your mother?" Charles asked, his voice trembling. Elijah took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he clutched the diary. "They fought. My mom and the man in the picture, they had a huge argument just before she left for work. He accused her of betraying him, of trying to get away from him. He said he'd make sure she'd never see me again." Charles's mind raced as he pieced the puzzle together. Richard had threatened her. He had pushed her to the brink, made her life unbearable, and in the end it had all culminated in her death. A heart attack, they'd said. But now Charles couldn't help but wonder if it was something more, if Richard's influence had played a part in it all. The guilt consumed him. He had always been so focused on his own pain, on the damage Richard had done to him. But he had never stopped to consider the others his brother had hurt, the people who had been collateral damage in Richard's war for control. Now, as he looked at Elijah, Charles realized just how deep that damage ran. "I'm so sorry," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have done something sooner. I should have stopped him." Elijah's eyes were full of sorrow, but there was a quiet strength in them too. "It's not your fault. You didn't know. But you can make things right now, can't you?" Charles looked at Elijah, his heart heavy with guilt but also with a sense of resolve. He didn't know what the future held, or how he could ever fix the mess Richard had left behind. But he knew one thing for certain. He would protect Elijah. He would make sure that no matter what, this boy would never suffer the way his mother had. The darkness of the past had come to light, and Charles could no longer ignore the weight of his guilt. But in the light of this new understanding, he knew that he had a chance to make a difference. For Elijah, for Sophia, for the future. The weight of the past hung heavily over Charles as he sat in his lavish mansion, the same mansion that had once been filled with the laughter of his late wife, Sylvia, and now stood as a haunting reminder of everything he had lost. His thoughts spiraled, moving through the fragments of his past that had suddenly come crashing together with Elijah's truth. The deaths of Sophia and Sylvia, the whispered secrets, the manipulations of his brother Richard, all of it now felt like a tangled web Charles had woven for himself, unaware of how deeply it would ensnare everyone around him. Sophia had known, Charles knew, that now she had known about the affair between him and Victoria. She had known about the lies he had told, the way he had betrayed her trust. But it wasn't just his own infidelity that had shattered their relationship. It was the crushing weight of his silence, the way he had abandoned her in her time of need, even as she was desperately searching for answers. The realization hit him like a cold gust of wind. Sophia had known everything. She had seen the cracks in their marriage long before he had the courage to admit to them. The affair had been the final blow, but it was not the cause. It was the breaking point, the moment when their world could no longer hold together. Charles paced back and forth in his study, his mind a storm of guilt and regret. He could still see Sylvia's face in his mind's eye, the pain in her eyes when she had discovered the truth. He had never told her about the affair, but she had found out. He had tried to protect her from the pain of knowing, but in doing so, he had betrayed her all over again. But it wasn't just Sylvia's death that gnawed at him now. It was Sophia's. The lies and secrets he had kept from her had pushed her to the edge, and he had never been there when she needed him most. Instead of offering comfort, he had distanced himself, locked away in his own selfish world. Sophia had been the one person who had tried to protect Elijah, and she had died for it, sacrificed for the twisted desires of his brother Richard. The truth of it all began to unravel in Charles's mind, piece by piece, and with every new revelation he felt the deep pang of guilt that he couldn't escape. He had always known that Richard was a force of destruction, but he hadn't understood just how far his brother's reach had extended. Richard had destroyed not only his own family, but also Sophia's life, and now it seemed he had done the same to Elijah. The storm outside raged, lightning crackling through the night sky as if nature itself was reflecting Charles's inner turmoil. He felt trapped by its own memories, suffocated by the choices he had made and the people he had failed. But the most painful realization was that Elijah had been caught in the crossfire, the boy who had worked tirelessly at the coffee shop, who had suffered so much, had become a casualty of Charles's failures, a reminder of how deeply the past had scarred everyone involved. Charles had been blind to the truth for so long, but now the pieces were clear. He had left a trail of destruction, and Elijah was the one left to pick up the pieces. The guilt weighed heavily on his heart, a heavy stone that threatened to crush him. How could he have been so careless, so blind to the pain he had caused? How could he have let all of this happen? It was in the quiet of that stormy night that Charles decided he could no longer live in the shadow of his own guilt. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't change what had already been done, but he could make a choice now, a choice to face the truth and take responsibility for his actions. The next day, he went to the coffee shop. Elijah was behind the counter, looking as quiet and solemn as ever. When Charles entered, the usual warmth of the place seemed to have faded, replaced by a tense atmosphere that hung thick between them. Elijah glanced up, his eyes locking with Charles's for a moment, but then quickly looking away. Charles walked to the counter, his heart heavy, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the full weight of the boy's gaze on him. "Elijah," Charles began, his voice strained with emotion, "we need to talk." Elijah didn't respond immediately, but his fingers clenched around the towel he had been wiping the counter with. There was a look of wariness in his eyes. He wasn't sure what Charles wanted, but he knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy. "I'm listening," Elijah finally said, his voice quiet but steady. Charles hesitated, taking a deep breath before speaking again. "I know the truth now, Elijah, about your mother and about what happened to her, and I—" He faltered, unable to find the words that could express the guilt and sorrow he was feeling. "I know I've caused you so much pain, and I don't know how to make up for it." Elijah looked up then, his expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What do you mean? What truth?" Charles swallowed hard. This was the moment. He had to be honest, even if it was the hardest thing he had ever done. "Your mother knew about my affair with Victoria. She knew about everything. And Richard, he pushed her to the edge. He made her feel like she had no way out. And she died because of the lies and manipulation." There was a long, painful silence between them. Elijah's face remained unreadable, but Charles could see the way his hands tightened around the towel. He was trying to hold himself together, trying not to let the weight of his words crush him. "Richard," Charles continued, his voice barely a whisper, "he made her life hell, and I wasn't there for her. I should have protected her, but I was too wrapped up in my own guilt and shame to see the truth. And now you're the one paying for it." Elijah's eyes flickered with something that Charles couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of anger and hurt, but also a deep, raw understanding. The boy was finally hearing the truth, and Charles could see the walls that had been carefully built around him begin to crack. "I didn't know about any of this," Elijah said finally, his voice shaking. "I didn't know she was dealing with all of this, but it doesn't change anything. She's gone. I'm still here." Charles reached out then, his hand shaking as he placed it on the counter between them. "Elijah, please, I know nothing can bring your mother back, but I want to make things right. I want to help you. I know I can never undo the damage that's been done, but I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're not alone in this." Elijah's eyes softened slightly, but the tension between them remained thick. "Why now?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you help her when she needed it? Why didn't you do something before?" Charles, his heart shattered at the question. There was no easy answer to that. No excuse he could offer that would make up for the years of neglect, the years of selfishness. "I don't have a good answer for you," Charles said, his voice breaking. I can only tell you that I was a coward. I was too focused on my own pain to see what was happening around me. But I won't be that person anymore. I won't leave you to fight this battle alone." Elijah looked down at the counter for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I don't know if I can trust you," he said quietly. "I don't know if I can ever trust anyone again." Charles felt the weight of those words settle into his chest like a heavy stone. He knew he didn't deserve Elijah's trust, not after everything that had happened. But he also knew he had to try, for the boy's sake and for his own. "I know," Charles whispered. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I will earn your trust. I'll prove it to you, even if it takes the rest of my life." The storm outside had passed, and as the last of the rain trickled away, Charles realized that the storm inside of him was only beginning. There was a long road ahead, one filled with regret, guilt, and the weight of his own actions. But for the first time in years, Charles felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't running anymore. He was standing face to face with his past, with Elijah, and with the man he had become. And somehow, in this broken, fragmented world, that was enough for now. The weight of his guilt had begun to lift, but only slightly. Charles Bennett had never imagined that redemption would feel like this, like an endless road stretching far ahead, with no clear destination in sight. His heart was lighter, but the burden of his past mistakes was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to remind him of everything he had lost and the lives he had ruined. But now Charles was determined to make things right. If he couldn't undo the damage he had caused, he would do his best to build something better from the wreckage. The first step in his journey toward redemption was the creation of a charity fund, a project that had been growing in his mind ever since that fateful conversation with Elijah. Charles knew that the only way to truly honor Sophia's memory and to atone for the mistakes he had made was to use his resources to help those who had suffered loss. In particular, he wanted to focus on children like Elijah, children who had been robbed of their innocence by the cruelties of life, children who had no one to turn to. He decided to name the fund after Sophia. She had been a woman of compassion, someone who had dedicated her life to helping others, even when her own circumstances had been less than ideal. She had been a pillar of strength for Elijah, and now in her memory, Charles would do everything he could to help others in need. The Sophia Bennett Fund was born out of that commitment, a charity designed to assist impoverished families and children who had experienced the devastating loss of a parent or a loved one. It would provide financial assistance for education, healthcare, housing, and therapy for those who had suffered the kind of pain that had shaped Elijah's life. Charles knew that a small amount of money couldn't heal the wounds of a child who had lost everything, but it could provide the foundation for a better future. The launch of the charity was a moment of personal triumph for Charles. He hosted a lavish gala, bringing together philanthropists, business leaders, and influential people from his circles. But the evening wasn't just about celebration. Charles spoke candidly about the reasons behind the charity, explaining how he had failed so many, how he had taken so much for granted, and how the loss of Sophia and her failure to protect her had pushed him to create something meaningful in her name. As the months passed, the Sophia Bennett Fund began to grow, reaching more and more children in need. The funds poured in, and soon Charles had an entire team working to manage and distribute the money. Schools, orphanages, and hospitals in impoverished neighborhoods were receiving grants, and the charity was making a real difference in the lives of children who had experienced loss. But even as the charity flourished, Charles couldn't forget why he had started it in the first place. He wasn't doing this just for the publicity or for the warm glow of feeling good about himself. He was doing it because he owed it to Sophia, and to Elijah, and to all the children who had been hurt by his past. Elijah had always been a quiet observer. He had seen Charles transform before his eyes. Gone was the cold, distant man who had entered his life with nothing but guilt. Now, Charles was different. There was a lightness to him, a sincerity in his actions that Elijah had never seen before. The man who had once been responsible for so much pain and suffering was now the driving force behind something positive, something that could help children who had experienced the kind of trauma Elijah had faced. The relationship between Charles and Elijah had slowly evolved since their last conversation. The walls between them had begun to crumble bit by bit as they spent more time together. They were still learning to trust each other, but there was something in the air now, an unspoken understanding. Charles was trying to make amends, and Elijah, while still guarded, had begun to see the change in Charles. It wasn't just the charity that mattered. It was the way Charles was living now, the way he was using his resources to make the world a little less harsh, a little more compassionate. One afternoon, Charles sat down with Elijah in the small office that had been set up for the charity's operations. The room was filled with papers, brochures, and plans for future outreach. But Charles wasn't focused on the work at that moment. He was focused on Elijah, who had been quietly flipping through a book as he waited for Charles to speak. "Hey, Elijah," Charles said, breaking the silence. "Can we talk for a minute?" Elijah looked up from his book, his expression unreadable. "Sure," he said, closing the book slowly and setting it aside. Charles leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "I wanted to share something with you," he began, his voice sincere but tinged with vulnerability. "You know about the charity, right?" Elijah nodded. He had been involved in the charity's outreach since its inception, though his role had always been more in the background. He wasn't yet ready to step fully into the spotlight, but Charles had insisted he be part of the process, helping with some of the research and distribution of grants. "I know I've done a lot to make things right, but there's more to it than just the charity," Charles continued. "I'm not just doing this for Sophia's memory or for my own redemption. I'm doing this for you, Elijah. I want you to know that this is for you too." Elijah looked at him, his expression still guarded. "I don't need you to fix everything, Charles," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You don't need to keep doing this just because you feel guilty." Charles shook his head, a pained smile crossing his face. "I understand that," he said, his voice steady. "But I can't change what's happened. I can't undo the damage I've done. What I can do is make sure no other child has to go through what you've gone through." I'm doing this because you deserve a better future, and so do all the other children who've been affected by loss." For the first time, Elijah's expression softened. The harshness that had once clouded his eyes began to recede, and in its place was something else. Something close to acceptance, though still cautious. "I guess I'm starting to believe that," Elijah said quietly. "But you've got to prove it to me, you know." Charles nodded, the weight of those words sinking deep into him. "I know. I will. I promise." A month passed and the Sophia Bennett Fund grew stronger. Charles's commitment to it didn't waver, and his involvement in the day-to-day operations became more hands-on. He worked closely with Elijah, encouraging him to take on more responsibility and allowing him to see the tangible impact they were having on the world. Though Elijah remained quiet about his personal feelings, Charles could tell the boy was changing. There was a lightness in him now, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. One day, after a successful fundraising event, Charles found Elijah sitting outside, alone, looking out over the city skyline. It was a rare moment of solitude for Elijah, who had become more engaged with the charity's work as time passed. But today, something seemed different. Charles walked up quietly and sat beside him, careful not to intrude on his thoughts. "What's on your mind?" Charles asked, his voice soft. Eli shrugged, not meeting Charles's gaze. "Just thinking," he said quietly. "About everything. About my mom. About you." Charles felt a pang in his chest at the mention of Sophia. He had spent so much time focusing on helping Elijah and others through the charity that he hadn't fully allowed himself to grieve for Sophia. There was still a part of him that hadn't come to terms with her loss, even after all these years. "What about me?" Charles asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know," Elijah replied, turning his head slightly to meet Charles's eyes. "It's just, you're not the same guy I first met. I've seen how you've changed, how you've really tried to make things right." Charles swallowed hard. "I have a long way to go, but I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop, not until I've done everything I can to atone for my mistakes." Elijah looked at him for a moment longer before speaking again. "I can see that now," he said softly. "And I think I can forgive you, Charles. But I won't forget. I can't forget what happened. But maybe that's okay." Charles didn't know what to say to that. He hadn't expected Elijah to forgive him so easily. He hadn't expected anything. But hearing those words from the boy he had wronged so deeply filled him with a sense of relief that was almost overwhelming. "I'll keep proving myself," Charles said, his voice firm, "for as long as it takes." Elijah nodded, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his face. "We'll see," he said. "But I think you're on the right path." As the sun set behind them, casting a warm glow over the city, Charles felt something inside him shift. He was no longer the man who had lived in the shadows of his own mistakes. He had begun to make amends, to create something meaningful, not just for Elijah, but for the countless other children who needed a chance. And though the road ahead was still long, Charles knew he was finally heading in the right direction. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, true peace. He couldn't change the past, but he was learning how to build a future. And that, he thought, was all he could ask for. Charles Bennett stood at the edge of his sprawling estate, looking out over the gardens that had once seemed so cold and empty. The mansion behind him, with its tall stone walls and polished windows, no longer felt like a prison. In fact, for the first time in years, it felt like a home, a place where healing was possible, a place where redemption was within reach. The road to this point had been long and painful, filled with the weight of guilt, regret, and missed opportunities. But Charles had taken those first painful steps toward atonement, and now he could see the beginnings of change, both in himself and in the people around him. The Sophia Bennett Fund had become a beacon of hope, not just for the children and families it helped, but for Charles himself. Each success, each life touched by the charity, was a small victory in his personal journey. The fund had done more than just provide financial assistance. It had restored a sense of purpose to Charles's life. It had given him a reason to wake up each day and do better, to live up to the man he hoped he could become. But more than anything, the journey had allowed him to reconnect with Elijah. The young boy who had once been a stranger to him was now a part of his life in ways that Charles hadn't thought possible. When Charles first met Elijah, he had seen only a reminder of his own failures, a boy lost in grief, with no one to guide him. But now, Elijah had become a symbol of everything Charles was trying to make right. Elijah had become a source of inspiration for him, a reminder of the power of resilience and the importance of second chances. Their relationship had grown slowly, like a plant finding its roots. At first, there had been tension. Elijah was understandably cautious, hesitant to trust someone who had caused him so much pain. But as the days passed, Charles's actions spoke louder than words. He didn't try to force Elijah to forgive him. He simply showed up. He listened when Elijah spoke, offered support when it was needed, and, most importantly, he showed the boy that he was there for the long haul. Elijah, in turn, had begun to open up more, to allow Charles into his world, slowly but surely. One afternoon, as they sat together on the balcony of the mansion, overlooking the lush garden that had been revived through their efforts, Charles spoke to Elijah about everything that had changed. "You've seen how hard I've worked, Elijah," Charles began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, and I can never undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I'm doing my best to make things right. For you, for Sophia, for everyone I've hurt." Elijah, sitting beside him, nodded slowly. His expression had softened over time, the walls that had once shielded his heart now beginning to crumble. "I know," he said quietly. "I can see it. You're different now, and I think that's enough." Charles's heart swelled at the words. It wasn't forgiveness that he expected, but simply understanding. That Elijah could see the effort, the change, the sincerity in his actions. Elijah turned to face him, his eyes steady, no longer guarded. "I don't need you to be perfect, Charles," he said. "I just need you to keep trying. And I know you will." Charles smiled, feeling a warmth that had been absent for so long. "I will," he promised. "I won't stop trying. For as long as I'm able, I'll keep working to make this world a little better, one step at a time." It was a moment of peace, a moment where both men were able to acknowledge the pain of the past without being consumed by it. Charles had made mistakes, huge ones, but he was no longer letting them define him. He was learning, growing, and most importantly, changing. The charity, the work they had done together, and the bond they had built, these were the things that mattered now. They weren't defined by what had happened before, but by what they could do with the present and future. In the months that followed, Charles continued to focus on his work with the charity, but he also made time for Elijah in a way he never had before. The once distant and cold relationship had evolved into one of mutual respect and affection. Charles had become a father figure to Elijah, someone who provided not just financial support, but emotional stability and encouragement. In return, Elijah had become the reminder that Charles needed, that redemption wasn't about being perfect, but about being present, and making a conscious effort to right the wrongs of the past. One evening, as Charles and Elijah stood together outside the mansion, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Elijah spoke again. "You've changed," he said, his voice soft but certain. "You're not the man I met a year ago, and that's good. I can see it in the way you act, the way you talk. You're living with purpose now." Charles stood in silence for a moment, taking in the gravity of Elijah's words. "I'm trying," he said simply, the emotion in his voice thickening. "I know I can't make up for everything, but I can live with purpose now. I can look at myself in the mirror and know that I'm doing something good." Elijah smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You're doing more than good, Charles. You're doing what's right, and that means something." Charles didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. There would always be scars from the past, and he would carry them with him for the rest of his life, but he no longer saw them as marks of shame. Instead, they were reminders of what he had learned, what he had lost, and most importantly, what he was working to rebuild. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Charles knew that his journey of redemption was far from over. It was a path that would continue to challenge him, to test his resolve, but for the first time, he was ready to walk it. Side by side with Elijah, and with the lessons he had learned along the way, he was ready to build a life he could be proud of. A life defined not by the mistakes of the past, but by the actions of the present. And as the evening sky darkened, Charles felt a quiet peace settle in his heart. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his road to walk. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough.